Hello, in this video we are looking at paper 3 Weimar and Nazi Germany and how to answer question 3a. Question 3a requires us to analyse two sources, so just to recap, a source is basically a piece of historical evidence, for example a photo, diary, drawing, newspaper article or a speech. So let's have a look at this question. How useful are sources B and C into an investigation about why the Nazi support grew from the years 1929 to 1933? First thing I would do with this question is I'd underline what it wants you to do an inquiry about. What is the focus point? Let's have a look at source B. It's a speech by Hitler in 1932, and it says, "Only we can restore law and order to Germany. Only we can fight the threat of the communists. We are the party that represents all of Germany. A vote for the Nazis is a vote for a better Germany." So, what is it we're going to do here then? Well, the first thing we're going to do is to analyse, look at just the contents. So in this case, just the speech itself, not who said it or where it came from. We're looking here for information that's useful to this inquiry about why Nazi support grew. Now there's a few things in this source we could look at. I've just picked one here, and the one thing that I'm going to look at is this line here. Only we can fight the threat of the communists. So, to start my answer off, I'm going to say, source B is useful as it states, and I'm bringing that quote in, only we can fight the threat of the communists. Now, what the examiner's looking for is your own knowledge here as well. So my next sentence is going to be, I know that, and I'm bringing in my own knowledge that backs up this viewpoint. So at this time, many upper and middle class citizens of Germany were worried about the threat of the communists taking over Germany with their increased support. They therefore moved their support away from the moderate parties to vote for Hitler, gaining him more support. Again, we can see it and have links back to the question. Now, bring in actual own knowledge when you're analysing the content. Don't just infer and say, for example, this means that this is the party that represents all of Germany. You've done your inferring already in the other question. Don't just say, I know it's true, and then move on. You need to prove it. And make sure what you're analysing is useful to the inquiry. Again, really focus on that question. Remember, the more accurate information is, the more useful that source is. Now we've done that, we need to investigate the provenance of the source. When we say the provenance, we mean basically the creation of it. Where was it made? Who created it? Why was it created? When was it created? We need to look first of all at what strengths this source has. So a speech by Hitler in 1932. Now, one mistake people can make is they can say that propaganda or speeches are not useful because they're propaganda. But that's not really true. Look at how we can analyse this one. One reason this source is useful is because it shows what the Nazis wanted people to believe, because it's a propaganda speech from the time period. So it's basically telling us, look, this is what the Nazis wanted people to view about them. This is why their support increased. This is the message they were giving. Now, this speech would have been heard by many people, and using my own knowledge, I know a lot of voters for the Nazis believed in what Hitler was saying, and it reflects what many Germans believed at that time period when the Weimar government was struggling. So again, we bring our own knowledge to back the points up. Now we're done with that, we need to look at what limitations the provenance has. There are some strengths, but there are limitations here as well. We need to explain them. So one reason it might be less useful is because it is still propaganda. So some points here are one-sided and exaggerated. But be careful, if you say that something is exaggerated, you need to show why you think that. So that's what I've done here. This can be seen where the source says, we are the party that represents all of Germany. Well, that's clearly an exaggeration, isn't it? Hitler might have appealed to many groups at the time, but it was not for everyone. The majority of Jewish people would not have voted for the Nazis, for example, because of anti-Semitic policies. So just remember this, back your points up. If you say there's bias in the source, or you say there's exaggeration in the source, explain why using the content. Now, the final step for this source analysis is to write a mini conclusion. So overall, how useful is this source and why? And this is what I've come up with. Overall, source B is quite useful. Always try and bring an extent in there. Is it very useful, slightly useful? I've said it's quite useful to inquiry about why Nazi support grew from 1929 to 1933. It shows how the Nazis were able to persuade voters by using fear of the communists in their propaganda. This source would have been seen by many voters, making it more relevant to the inquiry. Now, when you have a final judgment like this, it only needs to be brief. Again, give that extent, but also think about the accuracy. Does it match your own knowledge? If this source matches your own knowledge, it's a representation of the time. Also think about this: is the source relevant to the inquiry? And this is what our final analysis for source B would look like. Again, once you've read the sources in the exam, you'd have about 7 to 8 minutes to write this up. Only write one thing for each time. So one bit of content, one reason why we like the provenance, one reason why the provenance is limited. You can always go back and add more if you've got time at the end. Now, you will also have a second source to analyse. You must have time to do both, so plan and be careful with that. Here we've got source C, which is a queue of Germans trying to take their money out of a bank in Berlin. This was a photograph taken in 1929. Here we're just going to do a few notes to go through this quickly. So the photograph content shows many people queuing to take money out. Well, this is useful. Why? Because it shows the economic crisis in Germany after the Wall Street crash. Now, using our own knowledge, we know that German banks needed to pay back the USA after the Wall Street crash, and that meant the German banks ran out of money themselves. Some banks collapsed, like the German Civil Servant Bank, and it meant people's savings were lost if they couldn't take them out of the bank in time. Now, the Weimar government couldn't fix these problems, and so support for extreme parties such as the Nazis grew. What about the provenance here? Well, it's a queue of Germans, it's a photograph, people trying to take their money out of a bank in Berlin, 1929. So there's quite a lot we can work with. Why is this useful? First of all, the photograph shows there was a range of people. There were different classes, different genders, different ages in Berlin were impacted by the crash. Photographs can be staged, and we must be aware of that when analysing them, but this one matches our own knowledge of events at the time, and that makes it more useful. It matches what we know this sort of events did happen. Why is it limited? Well, a photograph is limited. It only shows just one bank in Berlin here. It doesn't show all of Germany. It doesn't explain how this led to Nazi support growing, and that makes it less relevant. And a mini conclusion at the end, I would say this source has got limited use into an inquiry. It accurately shows the impact of the economic crisis of the time, but it's not really clearly linked to how the Nazi support grew, and it relies on the inquirer having their own knowledge here. So, recap. What do we need to remember? Quite a few things here. First of all, time for the question, about 15 minutes or so, 15 to 16 minutes, and make sure you do both sources. Let's look at the bullet points. Make sure you're always focused on the inquiry. Do not go off topic here. Underline at the start what they're looking for. Make sure you're always talking about that. Bring in precise own knowledge. Saying, I know this is true, is not enough. Inferring from the source is not enough. Back your points up. If you're saying something's propaganda or if it's exaggerated, show this in the source content. It's not enough just to say it's an exaggeration. Focus on what's there. Do not run off a list on what the source doesn't mention. Sources aren't designed to cover everything. It's just a snapshot and that's it. Explain we've reached a final judgment on use at the end of each analysis. So is it quite useful, slightly useful, and say why in just a few sentences. And finally, do not compare the sources. Analyze source B completely and then leave it, move on, analyze source C. Nobody cares which you feel is the most useful. Your examiners don't care, and it will just be a waste of time. You won't get extra marks. So that's how you would answer question 3a on the Weimar and Nazi Germany paper. 8 marks, you have about 15 or so minutes. Keep an eye on the time for this one. Don't spend too long writing it.